Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tools and Beyond the Headlines. For several decades, Somalia has been plagued by civil war, weak government, and more recently, an Islamist insurgency. Since the 1990s, the UN and foreign governments have tried to support or influence what is widely seen as a failed state. Today, we're joined by two people whose role is to advise the government on communications, all in the hope of promoting stability and deterring conflict. We're here to learn more about their work and ask, does it actually work? Our guests are Simon Haselock, a former spokesman for NATO in Bosnia. He's worked on information operations across Africa, the Middle East, and the Balkans. Albany Associates, the company he co-founded, advises the Somali government. Hello, Simon.
Hello.
Good to see you there. I love your guitars in the background.
For show only, I assure you.
Yeah, okay. We're also joined by Yasmin Kamal, who works with Simon and has been running several projects on the ground in Somalia. Yasmin has extensive experience also of counter-radicalization strategies and communications here in the UK. To start with Simon, can you explain a bit about yourself, what you do and how you came to do it? And then in a bit, we'll talk about Somalia itself and what its current political situation is. So Simon, just tell us a bit about you and the thinking behind your strategies and your company.
Well, as is often the case with these things, I mean, I came into this more or less by accident. I was a soldier for most of my early career. I was 24 years in the Royal Marines. And at the end of that time, for some extraordinary reason, I was made the spokesman for NATO at the time of the Dayton Peace Agreement in Sarajevo. So I sort of catapulted into the sort of business by accident. And while I was there I did that job running the press conferences, etc., for about a year. To cut a long story short, I was offered a job by the then senior civilian, a chap by the name of Carl Bildt, an ex-Prime Minister of Sweden, and who was a high representative at the time, i.e. the senior civilian. And I was, taken, do I go, do I stay in the Marines and chance my arm for another 10 years, or do I take the opportunity to leave? So I did. I left and I worked in the Balkans, in Sarajevo for another 2 or 3 years, then in Kosovo for another couple of years. And then I was asked by the Foreign Office as a contractor to go to Iraq in 2003 as part of the sort of team in the Coalition Provisional Authority. And it was while we were there with a team that I'd assembled that we thought to ourselves, well, this is ridiculous. This isn't being done very well. They are sending consultants or individuals without the mechanism or the resources or the plan to succeed. And we thought, if they want something to be achieved, looking at it as a military planner, if you like, if you want an outcome, you want a plan and the resources to deliver the outcome. And at the time, it was fairly early in the sort of days of contracting in this space. And we came to the conclusion that rather than selling expertise as individuals, we'd be better to sell projects. And we said, and we came up with the plan to form Albany on the basis of saying, don't hire Simon Haselock, hire a project, and we'll tell you how to deliver what you're after.
Now you're doing this, you're not just doing it in Somalia, you've been doing it in Sudan. Just say some of the places that you've been working in.
Well, Albany, as I say, started in Iraq, and some of the work that we were doing as individuals translated into our first contract. And so we worked in the Middle East, and we continue to work in the Balkans. And then from there, our first sort of independent, sort of new contract, if you like, for Albany was in Darfur. So we went to Sudan. I spent the whole of that project in the field in Darfur. And that was largely about trying to socialize the peace process, initially the initial peace agreement, and then when that failed in itself, the peace process. And it was really about developing a technique to communicate at a very, very local level, so hyper-local level, and understanding the culture and ways of the target audiences and sort of adapting your communications techniques to do that. So it's not PR in the sense that we perhaps think about it, or even political communications in the way that we see it in the Western. It was much more about sort of trying to create an enabling environment for change to occur, whether it be peace processes, political change, counter-radicalization. So that's the business we're in. It's about creating an environment for people to sort of to deliver.
Yeah, so you're really talking about areas in which society is fractured. I mean, the state may well be, chaotic and fractured, and there certainly is a post-conflict situation. Let's just talk a bit more about Somalia as an example. Before we get into what you actually do and the sort of communications and how you, with the specific projects and how you implement them, just talk a bit about the problems of Somalia, the nature of its government. I mean, it has improved marginally, or perhaps quite a bit over the past few years, but just give people an idea of the environment you have to work in.
Well, I mean, I've been personally going to Mogadishu since 2009. So, our first project was, and as an example of how things have changed, I mean, it's easy to, when you see things incrementally, you don't necessarily see the change. But when I first went there in 2009, I lived inside a cargo shake-on, container, not even one fitted out, it was literally an empty container in a bush in the middle of an airport that was surrounded by Al-Shabab. The whole of Mogadishu then was invested by Al-Shabab. They controlled the city. There was one sort of island in the middle where the government, in theory, sat, and the airport where the international community sat. The fighting was intense. It was on all the time. Now, if you were to go there, you wouldn't recognize it. I mean, Al-Shabab is now, no longer holds territory. There is a government of sorts which semi-functions. It has writ over most of the populated areas of Somalia, or less so in the rural areas. And there is, an emerging sense of some form of democracy there. I mean, it's not what you or I might consider to be democracy, and that wouldn't necessarily even be relevant, but there is it is a significantly different place now than it was when I first went there. And I think one of the problems with these things, not to change the subject, but to give a sense, is that sometimes governments who are funding these enterprises have unrealistic expectations of how long these things take to improve. I mean, Somalia has been in a state of chaos since the beginning of the 90s, and you're not going to fix those sorts of problems in a couple of years. It's going to take an equal amount of time to return to some sense of stability. So, actually, contrary to perhaps places like Iraq and Afghanistan, in a funny way, I think Somalia is actually not quite a success story, but it's certainly more of a success story than most places.
Yeah, we can talk a bit more about the politics in passing. I know they're just about to have a presidential election. Somalia, I was surprised to find out, does not have one man, one woman, one vote. It's there's a college, an electoral college, and there are appointees from various clans, and there's an electorate of 28,000 people and a population of about 10 million. So that was some surprise for me. Talk a bit, Simon, about what are the basic problems that you foresee there, or you saw there, and what are the projects that you've sort of come up with to try and tackle that?
Well, the problems are legion, and they are not necessarily confined to Somalia, in terms of Somalia being a good example of the sorts of things that happen to a society that is basically war-torn for a long period of time, and where society fractures into very, very sort of hyper-local protectorates, if you like, where small groups are looking after themselves, and there's much less of a sense of even regional or national cohesion. So one of the problems is how do you bring together something that once had a national concern or a national consensus, when that consensus is completely broken down. And in Somalia, it's not just the bit around Mogadishu that you think about. I mean, Somalia used to be, well, according to the UN, Somalia includes what we call South Central Somalia, which is the sort of the rump around Mogadishu down to Kenya border, a bit called Puntland, which is the bit above it, and then Somaliland.
Let's bring up a map. We've got a map here, which we can little help. You talk through some of these things, so just so we know where you're talking about here. There we go.
So if you look to the north, so that area there, the sort of the bit on the top, facing north, that's mainly Somaliland, and then the bit in the middle of the lozenge is Puntland, and then the bottom southern bit and the sort of central bit around Mogadishu is the south central area. Now, those three areas essentially are almost operate quasi-independently, if you like, and they don't necessarily entirely recognise the authority of a central government. So it's a challenge to even consider it as a integral state. And a lot of the work that's been done over recent years has been to try and come up with some form of federal system of government where the various regions and entities consider that they have a certain amount of autonomy, but at the same time can hang together in the state of Somalia.
Yeah, so there's quite a bit of friction between the central government and the federal states who've got competing interests, and sometimes clan-based as well.
Yes, I mean, when you talk to Yasmin shortly, she'll talk about the sort of the real hyperlocal stuff. But I mean, one of the factors in Somalia is when people talk about Somalia, they talk about the clans, and there are 4 sort of large clans and then numerous what they call sub-clans or smaller clans, and the competing relationship between the power and authority of the individual clans has been one of the biggest issues there. So how do you recognize that there are these different pressures, and how do you get over the fact that the clans need to have equal representation at the same time? Somebody has to govern the place, and that's the central core problem.
So Simon, can you just give us a couple of examples, and then maybe Yasmin can follow up of projects you're doing it by way of illustration. So if you could just introduce, give us a couple of ideas, and then I'll ask Yasmin about those.
Well, I mean, what have we done? I mean, in the last, since 2009, I mean, our first piece of work there was essentially to support the African Union peacekeeping force, or it wasn't really a peacekeeping force, it was a sort of a peacemaking force. The problem when we first went there was that Somalia was very much known as a failed state. I mean, and you still to a certain extent refer to it that, but I mean, we used to look at what the narrative was for Somalia and the international community. We called it mission impossible, in the sense that the international community realized there's a problem. It felt it needed to do something. There were regional and national interests in stability, but people sort of didn't really feel that that anything they did there was actually going to be successful. That it was a failed, So the first task, if you like, from a strategic narrative was for us to sort of try and help the international community and the African Union in particular turn mission impossible into mission possible. So not necessarily, help solve the problem itself, but to actually give the sense that actually an international intervention in Somalia could be successful. Things could happen. So, we spent a lot of time working with the African Union troops on the ground. And when they were able to actually go on the offensive and they started to clear Al-Shabaab from, they had a much better and much more positive story to tell. And then, the story began to emerge that actually, well, things could be done. Al-Shabaab could be defeated. You could create a quasi-representative government. And it's interesting when you speak about, the fact that they don't have one person, one vote. I mean, that is a very sort of Western sort of construct when you look at it. And whilst what they have at the moment is not what they will end up with, the progression to that, where on this clan-based system, which is essentially the clans are dominated by the elders of those clans. The elders of those clans tend to be the people who tell. So if you had a one person, one vote, the person who wanted to vote would go to the clan elder and say, who do I vote for? And the clan elder would tell them who to vote for. What you have at the moment is that 28,000 sort of electoral college is essentially made up of the clan elders. So you have essentially, if you like, culturally, the representative group of people who would make the decisions about who people voted for, voting anyway. Yeah. So it's a system that it's not yet evolved into a system which will come to emulate more of a one person, one vote. But at the moment, it's pretty good compared to what they had before.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Yasmin, thank you also for joining us. You've had to, you work there on the ground, you've implemented these projects. Can you just give us a couple of examples? I mean, it's very varied, the work you do, and also has many challenges. So can you just give us an example of one of the recent projects you've been working on?
Yeah, sure. So there's a project that we've been working on for the past few years called the Early Recovery Initiative. And it's working on behalf of the UK government and various other donors that are involved. And it's a stabilization bit of work. So as we're talking about nation building in Somalia, this bit of work is, one of the kind of staple pieces of Albany, and Simon was involved from the get-go. And it looks at that kind of concept of stability and how, invoking better stability and stabilization efforts within communities allows for there to be better governance. So part of the main things the project does is act as a kind of bridge or interlocutor between local communities at a very hyper-localized level with government actors or, security forces in Somalia, or even AMISOM through our previous work as well. So it provides that kind of communication channel upward to those different administrative actors, but also we do a lot of engagement with the community to understand what their needs are in a post-recovery environment. So after the military have gone in to remove al-Shabab, we work really closely with communities to really understand the context that, that they've just experienced and what their needs are in order to have better kind of trust and credibility in local administrations.
So what does that mean practically, Yasmin? What do you have to do?
So we carry out quite a lot of research to understand community needs and sentiments, but we also practically do provide some kind of basic needs services. So an example of that, I guess that's quite relevant to the situation we're in now, is, COVID-19 did hit Somalia really badly as well. And during that point, we kind of pivoted some of our programs to understand how we can support some of the communities we work in recovery efforts with that. So we kind of worked with our local partners to actually physically build some Hamosh stations in Mogadishu. We were trying to get them to really hard to reach communities in rural areas. And we were able to do this, but you'd think just kind of traveling on a car or a truck would be the best kind of method to get there. But unfortunately, given the kind of insecure context that we're working in, a number of the different routes that we were trying to use had numerous IEDs that al-Shabaab had deliberately left to block those roads off and prevent that kind of transport and international support. And so the kind of innovation of our team and our local partners on the ground is to deconstruct some of the Hamoshes we just spent a few days building and actually put them on a small boat and kind of go in the shark infested seas in Somalia and really try and get them to the communities we're trying to reach, because at the end of the day,
going along the coast to different coastal communities and villages and then getting them inland from there.
Yeah, exactly. And what we did is, because we were engaging, with the kind of Somali National Army to kind of provide these services around COVID-19, it allowed there to be a better communication and trust building effort between these local communities that had just been under, the hold of al-Shabaab for a number of months or even years, to build up that trust slowly but surely with security actors or government officials, and provide them with the services they need. And in this case, it was basic services like Hamosh stations and information around COVID-19.
Yeah, I guess, Simon, you could sort of call it in a sort of grand way, it's the social contract, trying to make that sort of link of legitimacy between the people and the state, and saying that the state is there for you, and it's not just about clans, is it?
Oh, that's exactly what it is. And it's about trying to link all elements of government together. I mean, you have a society, regardless of the political situation, where, as I say, individual groups don't trust each other. So they don't trust the group next door to them, let alone some government, even in the nearest town, let alone the central government. So how do you create a dynamic where they begin to trust in the higher authorities, other than the man with the AK-47 in the next building along?
But how do you actually go about doing your work, Yasmin? I mean, I just saw a BBC program earlier today, and the reporter there still had armed guards, guys with Kalashnikovs. If you go into a hotel, it's still very heavily armed. Can you just give me an idea of what it's like for you, traveling around?
Yeah, I mean, it was, my first day actually on the job, ironically, was, Simon put me on a plane to Mogadishu. So that was my kind of first intro.
That was nice of him.
Yeah, so I was straight into it. But no, it was a great experience to kind of straight away meet our team. And to be honest, a lot of the work and the approach that Albany takes is we are heavily reliant upon our local partners and their understanding and deep like support and knowing, how to continue to deliver our program in the context of working in and be conflict and gender sensitive, and how we're engaging with.
And how do people get their news, Yasmin? I mean, I imagine that most people have got a mobile phone. Is that the in terms of if the government's trying to communicate with the people? What's I mean, newspapers are not going to be the thing, and I guess people are not going, don't have computers. So how does that work?
Yeah, so it's, I mean, the penetration of the internet across Somalia is quite high, but obviously when you go into harder to reach rural areas that we tend to work in, it is difficult. Radio is still actually often used and is able to kind of reach into more kind of periphery of villages that we work in. And one of the kind of examples of us trying to understand how we can reach these communities that maybe don't have that accessibility to communications or media is we actually created an opportunity for local community members, inclusive of minority clans and women and men and elders, was to create these kind of, provide them with these solar panel radios. So was able to listen in to the different government radio stations, but also different programmings that they were interested in, radio dramas, etc. But be able to do so in a way that was, cost effective and sustainable, given, sun is there all year round in Somalia. So it allowed us to be a bit of innovative in how we can approach and actually communicate effectively with these communities.
Okay. Simon, I think you've got an alarm possibly on your computer that you might need to turn off at some stage. You were going to say something, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, we, and not wishing to sort of use technical terms, but we talk about an information ecology when we talk about how do you communicate with people. There is sometimes there is there's that notion that it's a single mechanism that gets to people. Actually, it's a mixture of many things. And in the end, it's the conversations that people have under the tree or around the supper table that actually decide whether they believe or trust something. So, what you're trying to do is to sort of create the after dinner conversation, and by feeding that conversation with as many in as many directions as you can. So yes, it could be radio. It's interesting what you say about the mobile telephone. It's an interesting thing about Africa is that mobile telephones have sort of suddenly transformed the communications environment. They have had no copper wire or they haven't gone through a transition like Western societies. They've gone from almost nothing to having almost everything. So part of the problem is, how do you get people to sort of actually come to terms with the sort of sophistication of a mobile phone and when they come from a very traditional society. So it's extraordinary, the sort of the technological leap that's happened in these places.
So that begs the question. I guess the people who are paying you are going to say, look, we need some way of measuring your success. I mean, how do you measure your success? How do you measure the impact of this?
Well, I'll also defer a bit to Yasmin and here, but I sort of talk to the issue. I mean, there is now a sort of a sub-industry in the industry known as monitoring and evaluation of projects, and there are organizations who are specialists in monitoring and evaluating other people's programs. So one, we have to sort of create a monitoring and evaluation matrix of what are the indicators that we're looking for in a project that are going to suggest that things are going the right way. So depending on what you're trying to achieve, there may be the number of people that are from simple things, number of people looking at your stuff if it's online, to trying to measure changes in behavior, opinion polling, all these sorts of things, indicators of whether your messages are getting through. But don't forget, we're not there necessarily just to convince people of an idea. We're in many cases trying to get people to actually do things. And so, you can monitor, are the level of violence is going down? Are more people defecting from Al-Shabaab, or are more people not? Are they finding it harder to recruit? There are all sorts of statistical criteria that you might use, and it's a question of drawing up a matrix.
Picking up on that specific issue on Al-Shabaab, I mean, how bad is the situation with Al-Shabaab? The impression I had is that the number of attacks have increased over the last 9 months or so, and particularly as the elections were looming.
Yeah, I mean, it's a roller coaster. Again, I'll defer to Yasmin in a minute because she can speak to the sort of early recovery. But I think one's got to. There is no longer, and it hasn't been since about 2011. There's no longer open conflict between one side and the other. I mean, in the early stages with Al-Shabaab held territory, and it was a conventional battle with front lines and moving and a war of maneuver. That is no longer the case, and Al-Shabaab now operates as a terrorist organization, what is known in the trade as an asymmetric attacks. And in many ways, they're much easier to do. You know, it's much easier to sneak into Mogadishu and blow up a lorry than it is necessarily to capture, you know, a suburb of Mogadishu and hold it. And so so in many ways, a terrorist attack is a much easier thing to prosecute than to actually hold territory.
I remember you were telling me that when you were sort of first in Mogadishu, you had a word of advice was given to you soon after you walked out of a porter cabin somewhere.
Well, I mean, it's a good way of explaining, you know, you asking Yasmin about what the atmosphere is like. I mean, you can initially, despite the fact, you know, I had a military background, you can get sort of overconfident and slightly naive. And I was walking out of a government building into a car park when a chap I was with said to me, you know, look out for Yusuf. And I said, you know, what about Yusuf? You know, who's Yusuf? And if you stopped and listened for a moment, you could hear this noise in the trees. And it was spent ammunition that was being fired. And the sound it made, according to locals, was Yusuf as it went past your nose. And so beware of Yusuf was an acronym for make sure you don't get hit by a stray bullet.
So there's less of Yusuf around. That's the point.
And well, I would say that very much less. I mean, this is indicative of, you know, a conventional shooting war where there's a lot of ammunition being expended. Now it's sort of the odd explosion. I mean, I think maybe Yasmin can speak to, as I say, to more about what it's like at the local level, but certainly in places like Mogadishu and the towns, you know, if you get caught up in a terrorist attack, I mean, that's terrible. And some of them have been awful. There was one a couple of years ago which killed 500 people, a single bomb attack, largely fortunate or unfortunate, depending on which side you're at, because there was a petrol tanker close to where the bomb exploded, which wasn't sort of part of the plan. But broadly speaking, I mean, you know, terrorist attacks go up and down depending on the political circumstances, and clearly with an election coming and a contested election, quite a lot of political sort of heat. To a certain extent, one expects the sort of levels of violence to increase during those periods.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, Yasmin, and do you, I mean, talk a bit more about how safe or unsafe you feel, and in terms of just going out and about in some of the more remote areas?
I think you know, it's a different experience when you know, you go into Somalia and you're out there and you're working with these local partners. Is you're very aware that this is, you know, a war zone, and you have to be conscious of that. So I think it'd be kind of talking out of our character to say I wasn't, you know, conscious of that, especially I don't have a military background. However, what I think, you know, it was great to see from my personal experiences, we went on a trip to Hargeisa, which is the capital of Somaliland, and we were able to work closely with our civil society organizations, which were mainly youth, and nearly like over half the population in Somalia are under 18. And we were engaging with these young, energetic organizations and people that were keen on preventing violent extremism. And we went to Hargeisa, and it was such an amazing day to kind of be out there with actual, you know, young people that at the front line of trying to actually confront Al-Shabaab and the ideologies that they're spewing out. And we were able to, you know, go to these old caves that were present in the previous times and speak to these elders and sit under the tree, like Simon said. That is a big element of, you know, community engagement and dialogue. And it's in those moments that I felt actually very privileged to even be able to experience that, but also be part of that kind of cultural understanding. And I think to go back to, you know, Al-Shabaab and you know, their ability to perhaps have quite a strong influence, especially in more rural areas, is you're looking at, you know, quite big gaps in governance structures, especially when you're going into these remote areas, and understanding that where there's lack of, you know, opportunity, institutions and political strength and presence, then Al-Shabaab come in. And majority of the time what we find is it's their ability to resolve community conflicts, and most of these conflicts are over pastoral land and, you know, very localized raw issues. And their ability to do so is what kind of wins, I guess, elements of the hearts and minds of some of these local communities. So some of the work
Al-Shabaab's ability to resolve those issues, you're saying?
Yeah, and that's a mixture of, you know, fear and their kind of militant approaches to resolving it, but also the speed at which it is resolved. And I think where there's gaps in kind of institutional abilities around justice, around providing basic needs services, whether it's healthcare centers, those are the things that matters to the communities that we engage with, and we understand what matters to them. And that's where I think when you're thinking about notions of nation building or governance, you have to understand that building the trust in the government to fill those gaps in opposition to, organizations such as Al-Shabaab or other kind of clan militia groups that might fill those gaps in response, is actually really important in understanding the complexities at a very kind of hyper local level, why Al-Shabaab has retained control in these areas beyond their kind of militant.
And I guess, Yasmin, if you're a local business owner, or if you've got money, you probably, the Somali government doesn't have a great track record of being around to protect people in terms of security, whether it's the army, also delivering basic services. So why not pay Al-Shabaab?
I mean, it's an issue, and the issue around, taxation of communities is a problem. And one of the kind of strongholds that Al-Shabaab have is their ability to taxate the people that need the money the most, just for them to be able to travel through a road, to be able to go to the market to sell their produce. It's a constant struggle, and these obstacles prevent these communities from being able to kind of continue to live their daily lives and grow within a kind of socioeconomic environment that enables, the economy to grow and young people to feel that they have opportunities. However, while saying that, the young people that we have engaged with have been so energetic and resilient in actually being at the front line of confronting this. And whether that's through the projects that we support them with, or other programs or work that they do in the community. I mean, we've engaged with a number of different young people that have created youth peace committees and have gone on to be part of that kind of the youth peace committee of the UN, and been kind of creating model UN entities within their local communities. So I think, whilst we're looking at it's still very unstable in the community at the moment and across different regions in Somalia, I think there's a lot of hope and resilience in the young people that are kind of at the front line of change, whether that's in the diaspora or within Somalia itself.
Okay, I'd love to get questions from people now if you can start putting questions in the Q&A box. I know Simon Jackson's got a question coming up first. We'll come to Simon in just a moment. Simon Haselock, you were going to say something.
Well, I was just going to say it's quite important when you look at, Somalia, and we're looking at it specifically, but when you look at Al-Shabaab as a, if you like, an Islamic insurgency, people tend to sort of think that it's all about ideology. These groups gain purchase not because of their ideology or because necessarily any particular religious conviction on behalf of the population. It's about the delivery of life support. It's about dissatisfaction with the alternatives. It's about offering them. A lot of people join Al-Shabaab as soldiers because their family give them up, and they get $200 a month, from Al-Shabaab for doing that. It's a simple transactional arrangement. So, and that it's very similar. When people talk about the Taliban in Afghanistan, this isn't necessarily just about ideology. It's about a way of life and survival.
And Al-Shabaab is still pretty efficient at raising money, isn't it?
No, well, there on the other hand, you do have they claim a religious tax. The zakat, which people are required to pay, is paid to Al-Shabaab. That, of course, is not necessarily always respected, because people say, well, zakat is not for that purpose, but they're able to cloak it in that sort of religious sort of taxation system.
Okay,
they're also very good at taxing. If you I'll stop in a minute, but you talked about mobile telephones. In order for mobile telephone companies to operate, they need to put infrastructure in these places, and these big companies, which make a lot of money on telephones, obviously have to pay Al-Shabaab to have their infrastructure protected. So it's a massive economy, not just based upon taxing ordinary people. It's about companies and hauliers and business people paying to essentially protection money.
Okay, I do want to come back to you a bit about the sort of dark arts, some might call this propaganda. Yasmin, I know you've had experience working in the UK, working with sort of counter-extremism, and I think there's some interesting lessons that we can look at and talk about as well. Because you might say, if you weren't there and if you weren't getting these messages out, things could be so much worse. So I want to have a look at that in just a second. But let's start taking some questions in now. Simon Jackson to start with. Go ahead, Simon.
Hi. You're operating in environments where the perfect is the enemy of the good. So as a firm, when you evaluate a potential assignment, how do you decide whether you are stabilizing and supporting a legitimate and beneficent regime, as opposed to just propping up something slightly less savory. And I suppose following on from that is, have you done anything over the years that, with the benefit of 2020 hindsight, you'd rather have passed on?
Simon.
I actually, hand on heart, I don't think I can. I don't think I can say that. I mean, the first thing, that Albany as a company, we do not work. We have done some. I mean, I worked for Rugover for trying to help him understand the international community when he's looking for independence. That's but that
Ibrahim,
we don't really take commissions from governments, in the sense that African governments don't pay us to proper. I remember once I was in Darfur, and that was a Foreign Office paid project to support the African Union mission in Darfur, support the peace process and communicate the peace agreement specifically. And the deputy of the African Union mission was a very senior Nigerian politician, and he called me to his office once and said, "Can you help make our president legitimate?" And there's clearly quite a lot of money on the end of that if we'd said yes. And I said, "Well, I can give you free advice. Have another election." And then that was the end of the conversation. So we tend to be very, very careful, and we tend to only work for institutions like the UN on behalf of the African Union, though they don't fund very many projects. Obviously, our main government clients tend to be the UK government or the US government. The projects don't come normally through defense, they come through the State Department or the Foreign Office, and they are in support of what is considered to be legitimate international policy. We also sometimes look at solicitations that we're sent and look at whether they are deliverable. I mean, you could actually look at something and say, well, this is a stupid idea. We could go for this and get paid for it, but actually the chances of it succeeding are very low. And so we'll it's immoral, but also reputationally damaging if we end up sort of trying to do something that we can't deliver on. So there are a number of criteria, but I think, I don't want to sound too moralistic about it, but we're very careful to do things that we think are legitimate and support the broader international agreed processes in these conflict areas.
Martey Rhine, you've got a good follow-up question, which I think we'll put to Yasmin. Go ahead, Martey.
How welcome are you by the general population, given that you're foreigners and that your home country has a long history of colonizing?
So Yasmin, I was reading that there are quite a few expat Somalis working in Mogadishu advising the government, and there's a degree of irritation about how you've got these US Somalis and British Somalis sort of, dominating policy. How do people treat you when you're moving around?
I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, I'm half Arab, and so there's a big kind of Syrian population in Somalia. So I kind of get treated nothing too different. But I think for me, the question around being in a country, knowing the history and the complex history of interventions or colonialism is not something that is taken lightly or not acknowledged. I think what we try and consider when we're engaging in any of the projects is, from my personal perspective, is learning from the actual individuals that are living in Somali, that understand the context better than I do, to really inform me and help create a kind of partnership in being able to deliver sustainable and impactful projects. And with that, it includes actually me learning from those who have the better expertise of the country that we're engaging and working with. So from my personal perspective, when I engage with different kind of local partners or beneficiaries that I'm day-to-day talking to, it's a learning mechanism, and it's about kind of humbling myself and understanding what I can understand better about the context and how I can take some of my experience in delivering projects as best as I can to have a strong partnership, so that any projects or activities that we do are, we don't just go in and go out. It's about really learning and growing and being sustainable in any of the kind of activities that we're trying to achieve when we're out there.
Okay, Hilary Matthews and then Peter Sullivan. So Hilary first, if you're there. Go ahead, Hilary.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, can hear you.
Yes, I'm sorry, I kept hitting the wrong button to write my question down properly. First of all, I just wanted to say that Yasmin's comments about Al-Shabaab seem to be reminiscent of many other organizations like the drug cartels in Colombia, who pay the rural areas, who pay for education and pay for health, and therefore they get the support. That's just a comment, I guess, that it's happening around the world. But my question was more towards Simon talking earlier about the system of tribal and clan leaders in Somalia. I was born and raised in East Africa and very aware of the importance of tribal and clan leaders. And I have thought many times about whether a Western system of democracy, one person, one vote, works. I think that the clan leaders should be given. Why shouldn't the members of the clan go and ask, who do we vote for? And why shouldn't the clan leaders be given, as you were saying, some sort of a tribal federal system? But I don't think in that culture, the one person, one vote system necessarily works. And I think our Western democracy has been superimposed on African nations. And that's partly the reason why it doesn't work very well.
Hilary, I'm just going to push back at that slightly, because I know there is tension, there is criticism over this election. I mean, I think the clan-based system and the delegates for the Electoral College was really well thought over. But I think, Yasmin, I'm right in saying that there are many people within civil society who are very unhappy about how this election was being put together, Yasmin.
I think the areas of concern are around inclusivity, and I think that's around, maybe the lack of women that are going to be represented as delegates, the lack of kind of representation potential of minority clans, especially, with the clan elders kind of deciding who's going to be forward for delegates. So I think it's looking, when you're talking about the election process, and I completely understand your point, Hilary, it's understanding, how to make electoral processes as inclusive as possible. And I think especially when you're looking at the inclusivity of women in the election process, and more broadly in just the stability and governance of fragile contexts and states, it's really important when you're looking at revising electoral considerations, or looking at one person, one vote, how that just represents more inclusivity, but doesn't necessarily have to resemble exactly what it is in countries like ours or different.
So, Simon, pointless to have one person, one vote in Somalia?
Well, I think, again, this sounds terribly sort of politically correct, but what we try to do, no system for Somalia is going to succeed unless it's owned by Somalis. And so what needs to happen is that any international intervention needs to be designed to provide the space to let Somalis come to that construct themselves. And you're right, there is quite a lot of controversy about what the system should be. A lot of that isn't necessarily just simply down to representation, it's down to power, and who holds the power, and the relationship between individuals, not just tribes, but sort of groups of people. And there is a struggle at the moment between the current president and others as to the representation of the centre vis-a-vis the representation of the federal level. And these are the sorts of growing pains of these sorts of circumstances. Somalia was quite a successful state before Siad Barre went to war with Ethiopia, and rather like the former Yugoslavia, he, as a strong man, was able to maintain a sort of grip over the tribal and clan tensions. Now that is unacceptable to a sort of Western democratic mindset, and I'm not suggesting that it is something that would be supported, but it's interesting that some of the experiments that we've tried to attempt to impose or to create have led to the circumstances being worse than they were under a regime which we considered to be much harsher. So it's about allowing the system the space to come up with a system that works and works for them and is fair. And I think that's what we're trying to do at the moment.
You alluded it. Can you just highlight the tension between the President Mohammed and the sort of two regional leaders who've been in opposition to him, just to give people some of the background to that?
I mean, well, Yasmin might be more current on that than I am, but I mean, it's a long-standing tension, and it's largely, and a lot of it's to do with clan, and it's to do with the representation of the people around the current president and his clan structure and the influence of that clan, and the corollary influence of his challengers, who obviously are looking to other clan dynamics. And there is a view amongst one side that that Famaggio, which is, when you talk about the names of Somalis, that's an interesting subtext to talk about as well. Why is he called Famaggio? But when you look at Famaggio, his influence, his power structures, his attempts to centralize power is seen by other clan structures as being too centralist, and they would like to see a much more diffused regional center of power. So it's a sort of an argument between a centralist and a regionalism, and the relative power between the center and the federal states is where the argument has been over the whole of this election period.
In some ways, quite a modern political argument, you could say.
It is, yeah. But it's just an interesting event. It's interesting about when one of the things, if you spend your time, a lot of time in Somalia, they have, given the fact they're clans, the names are very similar. So a lot of people have the same name. So people tend to be known by nicknames. And so the president, Famaggio, is known as Famaggio because his father was an Italian Somali. Remember that the Italians were the colonists in the south central region of what is now Somalia. He lived and brought up, and he liked cheese as a child. And his father called him Famaggio because of that. And that nickname has stuck. And that similar sort of nickname applies across the whole of society in Somalia. They all have nicknames, and they give them to you. I'm not too sure what mine is, but I know that a friend of mine who was working there was known as White Hair, because his hair had gone grey, so he was known as White Hair.
Very good. Excellent. Peter Sullivan, who is actually our South African expert, and you spent time in Somalia, haven't you, Peter?
Yeah, I spent 7 months there with AMISOM and trying to control the narrative from there. And that's why I wanted to ask, how long will AMISOM need to be there? You've hardly mentioned the fact that the country has an occupying army of 28,000 people. And I mean, it's all very well to talk about the democracy and ways of voting and everything, but to some extent, it's only possible because you have 28,000 armed troops.
And that's the acronym for the African Union Forces, is that right?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, all these things are interrelated, aren't they? I mean, one of the things that they often talk about in these circumstances, be it Somalia or any other place, is that before you can achieve anything in terms of progress, you need to have some form of measure of security. And AMISOM has produced a measure of that. It's certainly transformed Al-Shabaab's sort of profile within Somalia over the last sort of 10 years, certainly. I mean, people's attitude to AMISOM within Somalia changes, and I know you've been there, Peter, because I think you worked in the organisation that we set up when the IST, the Information Support Team, was originally established. And I think there was a period where AMISOM was extremely popular, but the longer that any foreign force spends in a place, no matter how successful it's been, eventually people start to wonder why they're there. And I think they are at a very difficult moment, because I think AMISOM is talking about withdrawing, and there's a lot of discussion at the moment about that happening fairly soon. I suspect what will happen is that their mandate will be renewed. But I know that some of the countries that contribute to AMISOM at the moment are beginning to lose the stomach for it. So, it's not simply a matter of renewing their mandate. It's a question of whether the countries that supply the troops are prepared to sustain it.
Peter, I know you had a follow-up question as well about US troops as well, Peter.
Yeah, I had a follow-up question just to say, do you think Trump withdrawing the small amount of US troops there will make any difference at all?
No. I mean, the American troops there are essentially trainers. And the clandestine activities that they were doing, they will continue. That's another that's another story entirely, whether you think drone strikes and sort of special forces attacks are successful or do more harm than good.
Simon, that is a question, because they've escalated substantially under Trump's time in office.
Yeah.
How would you see that in terms of sort of public opinion?
Well, I think it's, I mean, I'm talking about a personal view now, and based on the experience of not just Somalia, other places like Afghanistan, Pakistan, etc. I personally think they do more damage than success, than the short-term gain that they perhaps do if you get an individual. But in Somalia, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that a lot of these attacks are essentially badly targeted. They don't even hit the right people, and a lot of civilians get killed, and that has a very, very, very damaging effect on the trust in government, or if you're trying to nation build, it's the last thing you want to happen. So, I personally have a problem with what are essentially extrajudicial killings. I think I find, as I say, my background is I was a soldier for 24 years. I spent 8 of my early soldiering years in Northern Ireland, and the great principle there was that if you're going to defeat the IRA, you need to defeat it within the rule of law, and that any sort of actions that were outside the rule of law were likely to have more negative effects than positive ones. And I firmly believe that, and I think that applies in all the theatres that we operate. So I don't think that they're particularly helpful.
Thanks for that question, Peter. I want to come back to the dark arts, as it were. I mean, some people might say what you're involved with is propaganda and be quite dismissive of it. And Yasmin, I wanted to come back to your experience. You've worked in the UK with counter-extremism programs, and I'm just trying to think of if you weren't there to control the message or adapt the message, what would the effect be? And I know you've got some concrete examples of this.
I would say, I think controlling a message is kind of something that we wouldn't really say that we do, especially in previous work that I've done. I think more it's guiding around understanding, sentiments when there has been, a terrorist attack in the country. And part of the work that I previously did when I was working, with the Home Office during the counter-terrorism attacks that happened a few years ago, was to understand the impact that will have on, communities and diverse communities across the UK, and to see, when you're calling something out as a terrorist attack, to make sure the language you're using when it's an Islamist attack and a far right, attack is the same, and you're condoning it and calling it the same things. And that's the kind of thing that I was involved in, is understanding the impact that language and messaging.
So give us an example of how it could go wrong. I'm just trying to think if there was a sort of a press release or a communication strategy where you think it could actually be have a very bad impact on the community you're trying to bring on side.
I think if when there was the attack on the mosque a few years ago, if, the government hadn't called that a terrorist attack, I think that would have had a strong impact on a lot of, Muslim communities in the UK. To understand that actually both, types of, terrorism are treated the same, are called out in the same manner. So I think if, the organization that I was working with, we hadn't kind of steered the government and suggested that, this is as bad as if it was carried out by Islamist extremists. It's on the same level, and if the language isn't used to condone it in the same manner, the impact that has in terms of perception of how different types of attacks committed by different individuals is treated can be very detrimental and can cause further divides. And I think during a period where there has been an attack in the country, you have to bring people together in unifying language, not further exacerbate divisions that have already been tried to be created by these organizations.
So language matters, Simon. I think you might be aware of Elizabeth Kendall's work, an academic in Oxford who's worked on counter-extremism in the Middle East. And she's looked at how Islamic poetry is used to convey Al-Qaeda's message in the Middle East. And apparently, unless you are able to sing your message in Quranic verse, it's not going to have the impact on the tribes that you want. So my question is to you, this comes as an outsider. How can you have a real impact if you don't really fully understand Somali culture or all the cultures of tribes in Darfur or wherever?
Well, you can't. So you have to work with people that do, and you have to be extremely careful to make every effort you can to understand it as carefully as you can. So, I mean, first of all, all our teams in every place, the first thing we do if we're going to go into an area which we don't know, is to find people living in the area or from the area who do know it. And then we spend a lot of time talking to them. I mean, Somalia for us is actually, a lot easier because, as I say, we've been there consistently for over 10 years. We have a lot of networks, a lot of local networks, a lot of people who we've known for a long time. And, we are very, I think we're pretty well advised. And I mean, I can point to all sorts of things. I mean, in Sudan, it's the same. And we do, and one of the, we discovered two things in Sudan, which illustrate your point. I mean, one, there's a group that are known collectively in Sudanese culture as the Hakama, and they are women who sing for war. And their job within the sort of tribe, if you like, in the sort of small society is to basically goad the men, out to go out and sort of do the fighting. And they sing these songs to the men to go out and fight. And talking to the people who were working with us, they said, well, they can sing for peace as well as for war. So why don't we get the Hakama to, why don't we subvert the Hakama to sing for peace? This was a Sudanese idea, and we worked with them. The second thing we discovered was that one of the ways that the Arab tribes in Darfur, those that are connected with the Janjaweed, how they settle their tribal disputes, how they get together, how they talk, is by racing their horses. So, we set up, a sort of derby in the middle of the desert in Darfur and invited all the Arab tribes to come and race their horses. And we had 55,000 people turn up. And we had this massive, in the middle of the desert, these races, big tent in the evening, lots of food, no attempt to patronize, just some experts, local experts in pastoral law, and they were then able to talk about their problems and think they were being listened to, and listen to experts in the subject, and you suddenly created a much more positive attitude towards each other than had been if you'd sort of tried to sort of preach to them. So it's understanding the local culture and what works and what doesn't work is really important, and it's not about sort of sending messages or writing press releases or making clever adverts. It's actually about understanding how people communicate.
We've got time just for one more question. Sheila de Beleg. Sheila? Go ahead, Sheila.
Hi. Yeah, sorry. I've lost my question, but anyway, it was about women, which is quite relevant.
I've got it written down here in front of me if you need me to say it.
What Simon was saying about persuading women to sing the right song. But Yasmin was talking a little bit about women, and I was just wondering what their position is in Somalia, and with regards to the education of women, for instance, in what is obviously a very male-dominated country, and where possibly presumably Al-Shabaab is against the education of women, and perhaps the majority of the Muslim population is also has that.
And female genital mutilation is still a big issue, isn't it, Yasmin?
Yeah, that is kind of an issue across Somalia still. I think there's been a lot of work in terms of, awareness campaigns and education around that. I think just an important thing to notice in terms of Somali culture with women is women are very integral to Somali culture, especially mothers. And that they play an integral role to wider communities, especially young men and boys, and they're very important to engage with for peace building and stabilization efforts. Something we found in a project we've just been doing around women, peace and security is without women at the center of stabilization and work around justice, there won't be successful stabilization or longevity in it. You found that there's many different kind of clan cases and issues that Al-Shabaab exploits that involve women, and that if women are not involved in the resolution around that or in the civic dialogues between the clan elders, then there's not going to be a resolution arisen. So at the end of the day, women are actually very, very integral to Somali culture and to the stabilization of, you know, different kind of resolutions, but also the wider country overall. And that's why their inclusion, active inclusion, I think, in decision making is something that is going to become an increasing focus for, you know, a lot of work that's being done in Somalia, and rightly so.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Yasmin and Simon, for your time. There we have to wrap it up. If you want to stay on for our after our discussion, please do so. But my thanks to Simon Haselock and Yasmin Kamel for a really interesting discussion about their work, the dark arts, if you like, nation building in Somalia. It's been a really, really interesting discussion. Thank you both very much indeed.